As Russian forces move into the Ukraine, Vice President Kamala Harris has been representing the United States on the world stage from Munich, and President Biden from Washington. What are we to make of their leadership? And what about Premier Justin Trudeau's leadership in Canada in response to the truckers' strike? And are U.S. government COVID measures winding down as the virus recedes? We'll discuss all this and more, plus offer a retrospective on our friend, the late P.J. O'Rourke, on this episode of Independent Outlook. Hi, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, where we try and give you a take on the issues of the day that does not fit into standard categories, but takes an independent outlook at things. And of course, I am joined today by my two partners in crime, my colleagues. First of all, David Theroux, founder and president of the Independent Institute. Hello, David.
Hello, Graham.
Great to see you. And also by our other colleague, Williamson Bill Evers, who is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Hi, Bill.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. Good to see you. And we're great to see all of our friends from around the country who join us on these conversations. Keep in mind that you can, through your various platforms, submit some questions and comments as we go along, and we will pay attention to those for sure. But let's get started. We cannot help but talk about what's going on in far Eastern Europe between Ukraine and Russia. Is the Ukraine crisis Biden's opportunity to win back credibility, do you think? What's going on with President Biden's approach to the Russian incursion, however you should call it, into Ukraine?
Well, he's trying to, show resolution and trying to build back Nato, which had been crumbling a bit, without any American boots on the ground. Now, of course, this is very dangerous because he's putting all these thousands of troops right next to Ukraine, and
the tripwire.
Yeah, and things can, sometimes things can stray across borders, and airplanes can stray across borders, so it can be a big problem. I think it's most important not to really, for us, to go into the details of this.
No, certainly.
You can turn on CNN, or you can turn on Fox News, or you can pick up the daily paper and get the details, where the army bases are, or what pathway Russian troops might be following, or are these separatist republics expanding into their pre-2014 provincial boundaries or whatever. I don't think that's as interesting as what is the ideology that's fueling Russian activity here? What is the ideology that's fueling U.S. ideas about inflection points between liberal democracies and autocracies, or what our strategic overall stance is and plan? I think that's really more interesting and important. So Russia is arguing, and Putin is arguing, two things. One, he's making a nationalistic claim. So, here he's got this big country, and he's at the top of it, at the pinnacle. He's a dictatorial ruler. Well, there's some freedom in Russia. They have a independent radio station in
More
Moscow.
than there used to be.
Oh, yeah. It's much better than under Brezhnev or Stalin or something like that. And it doesn't have an expansionistic ideology, even though the Russians were probably, quite a bit less expansionistic, socialism in one country, that sort of thing, than our side sometimes said in the Cold War. But anyway, they don't have that world, historical ideology anymore. So their ideology has to do with protecting Russian speakers, Russian cultural people, within the boundaries of Russia and also outside. And there are a lot of Russian speakers in Kazakhstan, in Latvia, and obviously in the Ukraine. And we're talking millions of people. So he views that as his mission. And there's also a trope of preventing genocide. So part of the ideology for Russia is drawing on World War II and the success of Russia and turning back the Germans and the German allies and so forth. So much of this thing in the Ukraine, the Russians claim, and it seems very bizarre to journalists and Western observers, is that genocide against Russians is being undertaken. and you know, even some kind of commercial difficulties that somebody might have, that's viewed as economic genocide and so forth. I mean, we all know how metaphors can sometimes run away with people, but this is a pretty major one. And so they are framing it that way. And, you know, you can, an old Hoover colleague of mine, Paul Gregory, has done an analysis of task dispatches pertaining to the Ukraine over the last year or so. And you can just see TASS is the telegraph agency of the Soviet Union, but no Soviet Union anymore, but it's only a major news service.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see the propaganda that's latent in this. Now, so the U.S. has a sort of different ideological problem. So when the Soviet Union broke up, Paul Wolfowitz, who was a policy thinker in the U.S. Defense Department, wrote a strategic doctrine for the United States. So periodically, you know, they do a strategic revamp. And he basically argued that rather than have pluralistic world, multipolar world, it should be a unipolar world. The United States should be militarily, strategically, culturally, politically, economically dominant and should have no rivals to speak of.
Well, I would say if somebody has to be the one totally dominant, I'd rather have it us than somebody else.
I don't see why can't there be multiple, multiple cultures.
If you create a monopoly, Graham, you know, look out.
That's right. So that's what they ended up doing. And instead of, you know, after World War II, I'm not advocating foreign aid or whatever, but the United States smiled on Germany reviving itself, Italy reviving itself, Japan reviving itself, and so forth. And but it did not really smile that much on Russia coming back. Russia was a basket case after the Cold War was over. And the U.S. just dismissed security concerns of Russia, which has a history of worrying about people sweeping across the North German plains or sweeping across the Russian steppes and attacking Russia. And, you know, so we didn't really accommodate this. We basically said, you know, you're the loser of the Cold War and suck it up. And so this essentially became a kind of a psychological prop for Putin with the Russian people. And so we're witnessing some of the consequences of this. So this is not to excuse invading another country, taking out its parliament. And, you know, I don't want to also state that Ukraine is some kind of perfect democracy. It's more, has better constitutional liberty than Russia, but the government there has shut down rivalrous TV stations and, you know, it has suppressed people at various points. Again, it's less than Putin, certainly less than Russia, Ukraine under Stalin or Khrushchev or something like that. Although Khrushchev did have a kind of warm place in his heart for Ukraine at various times, especially later on after the main slaughter was over. Anyway, I don't want to go on too long, but I just think this background is more important than the tactical moves of people.
David, your comments on that?
Well, I think it explains the background, the context of what's happening. And, you know, the reason why Putin is fearful of the Ukraine joining NATO is because he views this Pax Americana threat to be real, just as we would if he positioned nuclear weapons in Mexico. I mean, it's essentially that simple. But this tradition of being treated as second class that Bill's mentioning, I think, is part of it.
And when the Warsaw Pact, which was the military pact of the Soviet Union and its satellites, broke up, and when East Germany united with West Germany, the U.S. did give assurances. Now, they were not written down, and all the elites on both sides make extravagant claims about this, but essentially, the U.S. leadership said, we're not moving east of East Germany. And it hasn't lived up to that. Here's a New York Times from the 22nd of this month, and here's Thomas Friedman, the famous foreign policy guy of the New York Times, saying, This is Putin's war, but America and NATO aren't innocent bystanders. And what he's talking about there is precisely this, that we gave assurances that NATO was not going to expand closer and closer to the Russian heartland, and we haven't lived up to it.
Right, and then also the issue of having NATO at all.
Right.
What is the purpose of NATO? It appears to be, in reality, part of this globalist trend and push to consolidate countries into one unified bloc, just like the European Union, and so on. And you have the ambitions of Schwab at the World Economic Forum. He wants to essentially plan the world, basically, and there are environmental components to it, there are economic components. There's all this woke culture stuff that is folded into it. So I think that there's a portfolio, there's a cornucopia, really, of things that go into Putin's thinking. He also is mindful of his own political future, and
right, exactly.
He wants to prove that he is protecting
a war
Russians.
Leader. He's a war leader.
He's a national leader, protecting the Russian heritage.
Right.
And there's also an issue of Russian oil and Russian access to.
He needs that because the country is still an economic basket case,
right.
and the oil is
exactly
the only thing that keeps the government and the economy afloat.
Right, and it's access to shipping and so on. So there's a variety of these things all filling into this. And so my view is that Wolfowitz was totally off base, but understandable in his proposal, because that was a logical extension of this view, this post-World War II view that then got expanded after the end of the Cold War,
right.
Where the U.S. was going to be the dominant power in the world.
Right.
And so why would, we're interested in economics in the public choice tradition and the Austrian tradition and so on. We're critics of central planning. So why would we think that centrally planning world order is going to be somehow
and by the way, that's
exempt
what
those rules?
That's what all these statesmen around Europe are saying. Oh, Russia is the international order. It means the status quo. Right. Is sacred. How is Russia daring to violate this? Well,
yep.
It's actually the eastern border of Ukraine is not perfectly sacred. That's like saying Bangladesh should never have seceded from Pakistan, which was controlled by the Punjabis, and the Bengals didn't like it. Well, they left. And I'm not saying that it's going to be perfect if there's a Russian secession of very, very far eastern Ukraine. I'm certainly not going to say it's going to be perfect if Russia takes over all of Ukraine. By the way, in the West, where there's Uniate Catholics and past ties to Poland and Lithuania and Austro-Hungary, there are going to be big problems of guerrilla warfare for the Russians if they take
Bill,
over.
I want to come back to one thing you said toward the beginning of your remarks, which is that Russia under Putin no longer has the same kind of world historical ideology driving its power plays.
I think that's true.
It's reverted to an imperial kind of mindset.
Yes.
But that's very different from the international socialist mindset that the Comintern had. When the Communist Party was in the saddle, there was no natural limit, in principle, no conceptual limit to the expansion of that power.
It was only a practical prudential thing that Stalin and the others who advocated socialism in one country, they thought, well, time is not right, so to speak.
If what's driving Russian movement now is not that world historical ideology, but a kind of resuscitated Russian imperialism, am I right in thinking that there may be much more, at least, of a potential natural limit to the likely expansion?
So. I mean, I don't.
And should we not be encouraged by that?
I think we should be encouraged. It's no. Yep. I'm not saying if I were Finland, because Finland was part of the Russian Empire before the overthrow of the Tsar and before the provisional government and the Bolsheviks came. So Finland seceded. Obviously, in the 1920s, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were independent countries. But those are non-Russian areas in terms of culture and language and religion and that sort of stuff. They're Lutherans and Estonians and Finns speak closer to Hungarian than they do to Russian and so forth. All this is very complicated. But the point is, there are stronger cultural ties with Ukraine and with Belarus.
Right. And there always have been.
Yeah.
So let me just throw in another little wrench into this picture. We need to move to another subject soon, but did you guys notice what Peter Hitchens drew to the world's attention recently? The BBC had an interesting program that they filmed in Ukraine and then broadcast. And they broadcast it repeatedly, apparently. It featured a group of overt neo-Nazis who were wearing SS insignia, the Volksangel insignia on their clothes, and they were training Ukrainians on how to use AK-47s and others and so forth. And
I think this is, it's always been present. Putin has always emphasized this. I mean, Angela Merkel came back in 2014 after a meeting with Putin, and all he would talk about were neo-Nazis controlling all of Ukraine. I think this is a little bit like Justin Trudeau saying somebody had a Confederate flag or a Trump hat. Yes, these people exist. And
with one difference, that the people with the Nazi symbols in Canada were not teaching people how to use weapons.
Okay,
right. but the area,
the
Canada hasn't been in turmoil, but the Ukraine has been in turmoil.
Yeah, that's true.
And also, in times of natural strife, you will have people with ideological motivations, ultra nationalists coming to the fore. Right. I mean, I just, I certainly don't think that Zelensky is some kind of neo-Nazi. That's just
clearly
not true. And so I think that Hitchens and Putin are mistaken about this. Very interesting. A major general that was the chief of staff to the Russian Defense Ministry recently, within this last month, put a broadcast on this Echo Moscow liberal station, kind of classical liberal station in Russia, saying Putin should be forced to resign. There's really no threat from the NATO countries. He's living in some kind of crazy dream world. This is a top guy. And generally such people are not able to speak out in Russia. So it's not that everybody buys the propaganda. I do think we have an interesting situation in the United States. So just today, the New York Times had a column about the Ohio primary race in the Republicans between J.D. Vance, who's intellectual and written about the Appalachian sorts of people who have been not doing too well in recent decades economically. And he's kind of a Trump guy, but very intellectual guy.
Yeah.
And another person who's also running named Jane Temkin. And so she's a former state party chair of the Republican Party in Ohio.
Right. And
so
remember, the Timken family is a steel industry, a very influential long-term force in Republican politics.
So where are you going with this Putin connection?
I'm going because they're radically split on what to do about Ukraine.
Yes.
Right.
And it's interesting. Obviously, you can see even on Fox News, if you're watching Tucker Carlson, you're getting a different picture than the people earlier in the day, or Sean Hannity for that matter. So Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson are skeptics about this push to become involved in the Ukraine situation.
Are you saying that the candidates in Ohio themselves are taking opposite positions on the Ukraine question? And
they are definitely.
Which is Vance's view?
So
Vance is a skeptic, and he's in the Trump camp.
Right.
And Timken is more of a conventional Republican like Tom Cotton.
Right. Tom Cotton and Mario Rubio, and to a lesser extent,
Marco
Rubio and
Lindsey Graham.
Lindsey Graham are in the more hawk side of things, want ultra stringent. Some of these Republican senators are saying that the U.S. should militarily go to war and should have
I'm
troops on the
worried
ground.
about them.
And should be, and everyone, there was one, I forget who it was talking about, we need to prepare for tactical nukes. Who was that?
There was a guy, right.
So I think part of this reflects the change.
An obscure guy.
But still.
A senator.
Think that, a senator, right. I do think that this also reflects the broader issue of the elites versus the popular view, which is also what's going on in Canada and the U.S. and so on, but also the disaffection that people have with these endless wars. Talking about Wolfowitz, he was a big supporter of the Iraq War and sort of ongoing occupation. I
met him, by the way. He's a nice guy.
I'm sure he's a very nice guy. I'm sure he is. So in any event, I think all this reflects sort of an age-old issue of the center, the elites, trying to control the public for ideological reasons, maybe well-intentioned reasons, but certainly reasons that are giving them power and prestige and money, and socializing the cost and risk to the public. And certainly what's happening in Canada is that on stilts.
I just wanted to, before we close out on this topic, I want to mention a few places where people could go to read about the more skeptical approach to...
Oh, please, yes.
So there's not actually that many places right now.
Yep.
So we mentioned the 2 TV stations, the 2 TV people on Fox. You can go to the Orange County Register opinion page. It's skeptical about getting involved in Ukraine. Independent's own Ivan Eland, E-L-A-N-D, he writes on this. Cato Institute has...
Well, if you remember, Ivan directs our Center on Peace and Liberty.
Exactly.
Right.
And so another set of players are Doug Bando and Ted Galen Carpenter at Cato Institute. They are quite good on this. Some other classic people that write on this are Alan Tonelson and Leon Hadar. I would also suggest there's a site called The National Interest, and it's also a quarterly journal. Right. And it's not set one way or another. It has both skeptics and enthusiasts for getting heavily involved, and people who are, maybe exaggerating about Russia, and maybe some people who aren't paying enough worry to Russia. But it has both, and it has the realist view. So it's not a Wilsonian thing like what you hear from President Biden, where he talks about this inflection point between liberal democracies and autocracies. That's Woodrow Wilson. That's
I'll say. Yeah,
so
I must say I'm kind of embarrassed by some of the things that Kamala Harris said during the Munich conference.
She also sounded like a teenager. I mean,
she just did not
come
sound
on,
like...
Come on, guys.
She sounds like a Valley Girl is what she sounds like.
Yeah, it makes me feel uncomfortable for California.
Yeah, and another publication, Bill, also is the magazine, The American Conservative.
Yes, that's right. That's another good source.
Very much in that camp.
And so then another source is a thing called, for libertarians and conservatives, is antiwar.com. So that's maybe a little less scholarly than these other ones, but it often has excellent high-level stuff in it. And some of the people we've mentioned write for it. Right. So I think that's important for our viewers to know that there's a variety of views out there.
And if you take a look at the polls, you're going to find that the bulk of Republicans, I forget the percentage, but it's overwhelming, are against the U.S. being involved in Ukraine. And this is part of this trend away from the sort of internationalist, interventionist, endless war, policing the world ideology that...
but the Republican establishment is trying to use this to roll that back.
Yeah, they're trying. And it really is quite fascinating to see how the tides of opinion have indeed shifted. I think, as most of you have alluded to already, there's a kind of internationalist, globalist, World Economic Forum, sophisticated leaders at leading international and national institutions all now seem to be on the side of armed intervention for, I don't know, internationalist values.
Yes.
And others who seemed more populist and less at the top of institutions seemed to be more skeptical. One could almost be tempted to look at it skeptically and say, the people whose sons and daughters could actually be conscripted into war are pretty skeptical, but the people whose sons and daughters are at grad school in Cambridge, Massachusetts are kind of gung-ho.
This is J.D. Vance's exact point.
Oh, is it? Well, it's a disturbing observation.
He says that. He says, you know, my opponents are all sipping wine at Georgetown and Harvard, and they've gotten us into all this trouble over the last decades. Meanwhile, the working class kids are dying in these endless wars.
Okay,
and the phrasing is something along the lines of the U.S. will intervene in Ukraine and fight to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine to the last American death.
Right, exactly. Meanwhile, the sons and daughters of the working class in Canada have been organizing themselves in an almost wholly peaceful protests in Canada with the blockades that moved from British Columbia finally into Ottawa. And the representative of the more internationalist view, Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, member of the Liberal Party there, seems to have taken personal offense at these unruly, unseemly, unmannerly truckers. And the reaction in Canada from the federal authorities has been pretty drastic. I think it was on Valentine's Day when Premier Trudeau invoked the Canadian Emergencies Act, never before invoked in its 34 years since it was established.
Right.
And it was established for extreme emergencies, wartime, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But
things when no existing statute could handle the crisis, supposedly.
Yeah, but Bill, I mean, the problem of blocked, the Armstrong Bridge and other places that were blocked. The police came in, is cleared up. The people, in fact, the truckers even helped get it accomplished. So there was no emergency. There was no emergency.
That's right. And the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and the government of Alberta have both sued the national government under Trudeau, saying you had no business doing this.
So a couple days ago, Parliament,
like a half dozen provincial premiers objected to it at the time.
Parliament reaffirmed or reauthorized the Trudeau's extension of the act a couple days ago on a party line vote, which was utterly fascinating to me because it was on the one hand the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois from Quebec on the one hand, and then the Liberals on the other hand. And it was essentially a coming together in Canadian politics of Alberta and Quebec together on one side and British Columbia and Ontario on the other side. The two major.
I must tell you how out of date I am, because in my mind, the Bloc Québécois does not run for national elections. But
no, they do. They have seats in the Parliament.
They do now.
Yeah,
because for a while anyway, the Quebec nationalists refused to do it, and they.
Well, there was there 4 or 5 province premiers.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Eliminated the mandates.
Right.
So all the truckers want is the end of mandates. That's all they want, right? Yeah. And basically, since the COVID pandemic is clearly winding down, and so on, the issue is not the science. It's not COVID at all. It's really power. And Trudeau is fearful that his legitimacy and the legitimacy of the Liberal Party is going to be pulled out from under them. And so this is a desperate effort. And the irony, of course, is that a lot of people who were pro-Trudeau are saying you're going way too far. This shows that you're not responsible. You can't be counted on to make wise judgments for the safety of people. You're just resorting to brute force. So I think that what we're seeing is the truckers that started their convoy in Vancouver have, even though they've been cleared out of Ottawa, they have actually achieved a significant cultural success.
They really have.
They really have, and it's not just in Canada; it's global.
So let's segue a little bit.
These big trucks are kind of intimidating.
Yeah,
right?
they are.
And these women and men who are driving them are sleeping in the cabs, right? In the freezing cold outside. All the reporting that I've seen is of incredibly friendly, with families and bouncy boards and all this other stuff, and it's just, kids playing soccer. I mean, it's just the view that this was some sort of an insurrection or a threat to legitimacy of the Canadian government is not just paranoia. It really shows that Trudeau is about power, and that is it. Okay.
But look, just take a look
but
at this.
I want to
hold on a second, Bill. Just take a look at this while we're on this point. Here's a tweet from Canada. These protesters were called, white supremacists or whatnot. But here's an Indo-Canadian, a Black Canadian, and an Asian Canadian went to protest. They're asking, "Am I racist?"
Yeah, that's right.
This is what's actually happening on the street in Canada, apparently.
Well, all the reports also indicate that people universally were welcomed and offered food and so on and so forth. So it was a very friendly, peaceful expression. And since the science supports ending the mandates, in fact, the science says the mandates never should have been imposed in Canada and elsewhere, it's pretty transparent that what's going on here is power mongering.
Your point.
So I want to segue to the United States, but still stay on this topic.
Yep.
So right now in Washington, D.C., they're putting up barricades all around the central government area there, Capitol Hill and so forth, because there may be a trucker convoy in the United States approaching Washington, D.C. And we don't know what measures will be used against it. But another thing that many political commentators in the United States are saying is, look what was done to the bank accounts of the people participating in the protest in Ottawa and other Canadian cities.
That's the scariest thing.
Look what's happened to the donors. So some people, older lady, 50 years old, 80 years old, sends in $25, $50, and they got in terrible trouble.
Yeah, a woman named Brianne in Chilliwack, British Columbia, gave $50.
Her bank account is frozen.
That's right, because she gave $50
indefinitely.
Well, so they, by the way, today's New York Times says they've unfrozen these accounts.
Well, only because of public pressure.
That's right.
I agree.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, it's a nightmarish thing, and it's something that the U.S. government might view as to try. So,
well, Biden sent a note to the Congress saying he's going to extend the emergency measure.
Exactly. Very good point.
Yeah, and to Naomi Wolf's credit, she was one of the first to raise this question about Americans. You better keep watching what's going on in Canada because it's not that far-fetched. It might come here, partly because Biden has said nothing to critique Trudeau.
Exactly.
And second,
because here is supposedly a big spokesperson for human rights. Well,
right.
What about human rights and somebody who's in our own political traditions in some ways, anyway?
Right. So Harris is complaining about authoritarianism in the Ukraine with Putin and so on, and here we have this is really most blatant. No, it's in many respects it's similar to what they did in Australia, which happened earlier, and that's
especially Melbourne. Yeah.
Right, and that's part of Naomi Will's point is that these other countries are legitimizing it in the minds of a lot of people. And this, of course, this all heralds back to the warnings that Bob Higgs had in his book, Crisis and Leviathan, how these crises are used to justify power, and interest groups use it to fatten their coffers and get powers they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So Biden is clearly incredibly fearful, far more before this started than Trudeau was about his legitimacy, because his popularity is absolutely, I mean, it's going subterranean. I mean, it's amazing.
You're talking Biden or Trudeau on that
Biden,
point?
Biden right now.
Yeah.
Right. And so he wants something that's going to resurrect his poll ratings, and that's part of the reason for the Ukraine situation, saber rattling and so on, saber rattling. And So he wants to be viewed as this great leader, and emergencies give an excuse to do all sorts of things that
Right.
Allegedly have to be done to protect people's safety.
One of our friends on the call, Jeffrey, is just sending in a message question here. Can we believe the polls that indicate strong support for Trudeau among Canadians? I don't know how to answer that question.
Well, there has been, the polls have shown that there was a significant group in Canada that were supporting Trudeau, but that's been eroding.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that.
So one thing is that there's this. We saw this during the anti-war movement in the United States. So as time went on, the public said, "Well, we agree with your goals, but not with your tactics." In other words, stop occupying buildings, stop rioting in the streets, but maybe this Vietnam War is not working out too well, and maybe we need to withdraw. So I think a certain amount of opinion poll data in Canada shows that the public has more sympathy for the concerns of the truckers than it does for the tactics of the truckers.
That's true.
Right, but as I said before, what Trudeau has done is he's moved a lot of people into the camp of supporting the truckers because they didn't think Trudeau was so radical in his response. Getting back to this convoy in the United States, I've heard and seen different numbers about how many trucks are going to be involved, in the thousands.
Wow.
Maybe over 30,000. But whatever it is, the plan is they'll be picking up trucks in the convoys that go across the country, but they have no plans of entering Washington.
Oh, good.
So the fencing will be viewed as overreaction.
It will be, yeah.
Right? And if people are, camping out on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. in different ways and raising the same questions, it's going to be even harder for Biden to justify with the kind of things that Trudeau did. I don't think Biden is that stupid, but, who knows?
But, Jeffrey's point is interesting that there is, as we've acknowledged, a lot of support for Trudeau's position in Canada, even though there's increasing dissent from it. But you mentioned Naomi Wolf. One of her observations is that what's especially striking is that there's an amazingly wide willingness on the part of the public in Western countries, including the U.S. and Canada, to subside, to acquiesce, to hunker down, to obey, to submit. Submission seemed to be a surprisingly wide impulse in countries once dedicated to individual liberty. Why is submission so remarkably attractive to so many people still?
I think the reason is because these countries are based on a tradition of the rule of law and liberty and constitutional constraints in different forms. And over time, that's been more and more nationalized into the central government. Mm-hmm. And you've added the whole progressive array of measures.
Rule of experts.
Rule of experts on environment, healthcare, whatever, schools, etc. And so the average person could not distinguish between one or the other. And so the legitimacy of these governments was stronger. But when it comes to a point where they're doing things that are outrageous, that delegitimize their behavior in the minds of people, the logical thing is for people to go back to where the original ideas came from. Once it was the Tea Party, I think a lot of Trump supporters are basing that in that kind of tradition too. And I think that if you go from country to country, you'll see this all over the world. This whole convoy development is being copied in other countries, in France and so
talking.
Go ahead.
So I'm just thinking about this reaction, this boomerang effect of the rule of experts and the harsh measures connected with lockdowns and in the name of combating COVID-19. And I think that was a major part of the recall of the school board in San Francisco across the bay from us. So they had a very left-wing school board. San Francisco is progressive city, has like single-digit Republican registration.
Icon of progressivism.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, they had this strongly leftist center school board, and they were one of the harshest and earliest and most thorough in their lockdowns for the public schools. And very little flexibility or give, not willing to come back again. So then they spent their time, instead of trying to figure out how to accommodate this, how to get the kids back in front of teachers, they spent their time changing the names of public schools. So they did all this.
They wanted to take Dianne Feinstein's name
Right,
off of high
right.
school because she was such a horrible right-wing
Racist.
something
Right,
or other.
right. So that gives you some idea of how left-wing they were.
Yeah, and I think
Dianne, you can say Dianne Feinstein is sort of a moderate Democrat, but nonetheless, she's not a racist.
Right, that's for sure.
And of course, the fear among a lot of progressives is that, we saw what happened in Virginia and other places in the last election. Now, even in San Francisco, and Gavin Newsom had I'm not sure if it was a whole press conference, but he was talking to the media about, it means nothing. It's not a reflection of discrediting of these ideas. And of course, he's trying to have it both ways.
Oh, indeed.
Right.
I think
it is a huge development.
There's no doubt
right.
that Chinese Americans, Asian Americans in San Francisco
Mm-hmm.
organized well and explicitly against these ideas. Now, one of the manifestations was we have some special admissions high schools in San Francisco that are magnet schools that are highly academic, most famously Lowell High School.
Yep.
And the school board supposedly as a special COVID thing, but really they intended to do this at whatever excuse they could come up with. They put a lottery for getting in, lottery for admission.
Instead of merit.
The Asian Americans who struggle very hard to advance themselves, particularly immigrants, to go through Lowell High School as their ticket to success in life and helping their families and so forth. And they viewed this as a kind of a serious attack on them.
Well, it's
they
not
were
just a serious
very,
attack.
very organized in this.
It's not just a serious attack on them. It's basically saying that merit and doing your homework makes no difference.
That's right. But the Asian culture has a strong support for doing your homework and buckling down and taking academics very seriously. And not only that, one of the members who was recalled, a woman named Collins, had written that Asians are the house slaves of the racist white hegemony establishment.
Goodness. That's blatant racialism.
Well, you can see why Asian Americans didn't take that too well.
Yeah, but it wasn't just them. I looked earlier today at a fascinating article giving a breakdown of voting precincts all across the city of San Francisco. There are dozens of voting precincts, several dozen. And there were only 3 where the pro-recall margin was less than 50%. The vast majority of African-American neighborhoods was all over 50%, and other neighborhoods was in the 90s.
Yes.
It was stunning.
Where were the holdouts? There
was a couple little anomalous spots way down near Daly City border.
Oh, okay.
Oddly
enough.
So
it wasn't some.
It wasn't obvious.
Okay.
Right, and I think was it Lopez or Collins? I forget. Was then saying, the reason for this recall is because it was Lopez saying it's a bunch of white supremacists.
Right. And the Republican Party, supposedly. The Republican Party.
So-called.
I mean, I might know all the Republicans in San Francisco. It's
but this
tiny number.
This also reflects the not just naivete, but the foolishness of the progressive perspective, that they just don't understand what they're doing and its impact, and they don't understand why anybody is against it.
Right.
And the only thing they can. Right. So their explanation is always going to be way off the mark, which just makes them more ludicrous.
Mm-hmm.
So I do want to say something, though, before a false optimism comes over people. So you'd think, okay, this rebellion's going on. Where are fabulous candidates for state superintendent of public instruction in California.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know a guy named George Yang. He's a very nice guy, but he's not really, doesn't really have the credentials or the stature. Of course, miracles happen. Maybe he's going to win. But the thing is,
this is a grassroots phenomenon, though.
Yeah, I agree that. But what I'm saying is, there's not a grassroots leader, say, of that campaign in San Francisco who's now trying to run for state superintendent. There's not, we've had other various kinds of rebellions in the schools around California. There are public policy people that are critics that could run for state superintendent. People younger than me. The point is, there are people from the charter school movement in Los Angeles. We had in the last election for this position a very prominent charter school person. Now, I'm not sure what his position is on some of these political correctness, critical race theory issues that are floating around out there. But he's certainly not the tool of the education establishment.
So the parents and
so
voters...
they need a good candidate. You can't turn out the bad candidates.
Mm-hmm.
Many positions don't really have a recall, and recall, somebody's going to replace them. Now, the mayor of San Francisco is going to replace these school board members, and the mayor of San Francisco for the Democratic Party in California is a moderate, so she may do okay in these appointments, and she supported the recall.
Yes, that's right.
Pretty amazing.
But this is a grassroots phenomenon on a local scale,
right?
And I think most of the people involved saw they could make a difference that way. I would suspect.
And they're not necessarily professional political people. That's a good thing. But on the other hand, eventually somebody who's good
but I don't think they're viewing it as a statewide problem for them.
It is.
And they don't, and that's part of the reason why you, as director of our Center on Educational Excellence, what you're doing is so important to raise the consciousness and understanding of people about the threat of math woke and critical race
woke
theory,
math, right? Yeah,
and woke math and so on.
Interestingly, the parents and non-parents who were voting in that recall election in San Francisco, they were not only recoiling against this excessive, exaggerated critical race theory, which is actually a form of racism, but they were also insisting that the schools really should have been open for students, that they were really dissenting from the so-called expert opinion on COVID measures in San Francisco.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of the bridge. Also, is Newsom is, continues to follow the union line, and so I think that will also be part of the puzzle that people put together to say we've got to get this changed on a state level too.
Yeah. Did I see that President Biden has officially extended the national emergency status for COVID?
Yeah, we discussed that earlier.
Yeah. He indicated that he's planning on doing that, and this is in time for his State of the Union message, too.
Right. Now, I think one thing he probably won't be required to address during that message, but I wish he would, is the question of the data behind the pandemic measures. And I think you know something about the way, David, about the way the CDC has withheld data has caused a lot of questions. Can you inform us a little bit about that and what it means?
Well, it was discovered, it was sort of released, well, two things. One was that when they recently released their updated data, as the CDC collects data from all these states and so forth, and they released it, and some reporters noticed, and others, some scientists noticed that there was a big omission, and the omission was for 18 to 49-year-olds. And this particular age group essentially is one that is likely to benefit from extra shots because the first two doses already left them well protected, or not. So why have they not made this information available?
Why don't we know about hospitalization data, death data?
That's right,
so
hospitalization data. Why do we not know about wastewater data?
It's been withheld.
Yeah, that's right.
It's been withheld, that's right.
So the thing is, yes, people might misinterpret it. At least some people will. But scientists also can't dig into it if they don't have it, and they can't interpret it properly.
Yeah,
and they can't make important public health decisions about whether, as David was mentioning, boosters or other, where are areas of concentration of problem? What explanations can we give
David,
for what's
continue
going
that
on?
other thought you had.
Yeah.
Well, they're Kristen Nordstrom is the spokeswoman for the CDC, said the agency had been slow to release the different streams of data because basically at the end of the day, it's not yet ready for prime time. And then she says, another reason is fear the information might be misinterpreted. So that set off all sorts of red light alarms in people's minds about, well, is there something wrong about the data that shows that people, and the fear, which that was admitted, was that people who are skeptical of the vaccines will see it even more likely to cause problems, or it makes no difference. Making no difference was, I think, the biggest fear they had.
That would be the biggest fear of all.
Right. And so I think that it's very strange, and there's just a whole slew of scientists and reporters now who are asking about this for good reason.
I think it's right that they ask, but it also may be right that it's not ready for prime time, the data.
Well, part of it is the computer system the CDC has is ancient.
Woefully
behind.
deficient.
But then why is the CDC commissioned with doing it? Why not have private sector firms that are doing it? But the bigger picture is that, again, the COVID crisis is radically coming to an end. The Omicron strain is not a serious threat. Most people, the great majority of people are vaccinated. The people who've had COVID are not, they have immunity, they're not going to get it, at least far less likely than even people who are vaccinated, quite frankly. Was it 21
Or they're going to
times
get a
what the
mild
Israelis
case
show?
if they get it.
They'll get a very mild case, right? But anyway, the point is that it's not a serious threat. So why are they hiding the data? Well, I think they're hiding it, quite frankly, for political reasons. Sort of like Fauci, when he originally said no one should wear a mask because it has no effect, which actually the science does say that's the case. And he says, then subsequently he said, well, the only reason I said that was I was afraid there weren't enough masks to go around for health workers. But that raises the question too: why does the CDC have a monopoly on the masks? Because any entrepreneur would love to get the money if they can make masks, and in a lot of places converted, but it was all centralized to the CDC. Anyway,
testing.
This is an important development, and it could be a real scandal if it means that the data, just like in the issue of climate, is being fudged.
Right. Mm-hmm. By experts.
Right. And part of the issue is the confusion, as Bill was saying, about people who are hospitalized. Do they have comorbidities?
Right.
Did they die of a car crash and they had COVID, or they actually die of the COVID infection? And there are different estimates about this, and I've seen a great wide range of them. But if you're hiding the data, we won't know.
Right.
I want to make sure.
Is, unlike with climate, in this case, even the New York Times is asking the question,
yes.
Why is the data withheld?
That's right.
I mean, even if it's withheld for an
and
innocent reason, it still raises unnecessary questions.
And all of this is part of this awakening, I think, that people see that they're being lied to, or they're not giving the full story, or they're changing the story about COVID, about climate, about war and peace, about political power. And so I think that is just basically making this grassroots movement about the schools and so forth even more powerful. So it's not just located in Virginia or San Francisco. It's all over the place.
I'd like to inject that one of the things in the news that's been complicated and that's been, I think, distorted by many of the major news media is the Durham filing. So before we get to P.J. O'Rourke, I think we should try and squeeze
give us a thumbnail sketch.
I know this is very hard to explain. So Durham is doing this probe on the Trump-Russia collusion charges that existed for years during the Trump campaign and then the Trump administration. And he's looking into the origins and who did what to him. So one of the people that he's looking into is a lawyer named Michael Sussman, who worked for a law firm that was under, the law firm for the Hillary Clinton campaign and was intermeshed with the Clinton campaign. So Sussman was approached by a technical company executive who was doing cybersecurity work for the United States government, including for the White House. And this man said that a Russian bank was having some kind of buzzing, interacting something with something in the Trump building, and also that there were Russian iPhones, Russian pocket computer phones, in the Trump area and the White House and so forth. And that, so interacting with Sussman pushed him to try to present this as indicative of Trump-Russia collusion. That
Durham
Trump was
says
some
it
kind
wasn't
of spy.
indicative of that.
Durham says it was not indicative of that, and that this was a put-up job. So So the news media, instead of focusing on this, which is a pretty serious charge, and it sort of vindicates President Trump, who claimed people were spying on him, and you see, indeed they were, including the early weeks of the Trump administration.
Right.
So the media is saying, no, it was never the Trump administration. It was only during the Obama administration. That's not true. It definitely was January also of the Trump administration, January,
First
February.
few weeks, right.
Exactly. And secondly, it's not, they say, the Trump, Clinton didn't pay, to have this done. Well, excuse me. What happened was Clinton paid this law firm, and the law firm was interacting. We're not going to have all the details of how, what way they were interacting with this tech executive who was being promised a job in the Clinton administration. So
if he could develop a narrative implicating Trump.
Right.
Okay, so I think we can see how serious it is, but I don't, except for the amazing fact that the news media most completely ignored this, except for a few things trying to defend Hillary Clinton.
Right. CNN's coverage was really, really muted. Fox News made a big deal of it, but they kind of squawked in a way that almost made people skeptical of the story.
Yes. Yeah.
The facts should be soberly considered.
They should be.
They're significant.
Yep.
And the Media Research Council, which also runs a thing called Newsbusters, tabulated how much the broadcast networks spent on this. And you'd see 0 CBS, 0 ABC, one network did 2 minutes, and 0 PBS, et cetera, et cetera. It's sort of amazing how little treatment they gave to it.
So last week, there was a piece in the New York Times talking about P.J. O'Rourke, who they say wrote with a high cranky style in a shrinking tradition. We lost P.J. O'Rourke. David, you knew him. Can you talk to us about him?
P.J. died at the age of 74. He was originally from Ohio. He got a master's degree in English at Johns Hopkins and started writing for a couple sort of underground newspapers in Baltimore. And he was then noticed by the National Lampoon and was offered some writing opportunities there and went on to become the editor of the National Lampoon. And he was, in some respects, a product of the 60s. He came of age in the late 60s. And so the counterculture was there, and it affected youth across the spectrum. And I think he was affected by that. And but to his credit, in fact, when he was with this one underground newspaper called Harry in Baltimore, he fashioned himself as a Maoist, which means he knew probably next to nothing about it. And it was just the thing to do. And one of the ironies is that when he was working there, this Maoist group then raided the office and shut them down because they were not Maoist enough. And he wrote a funny piece
that happened
about
in
that.
Berkeley too. Things
Yeah,
like that.
I think that's right. So in any event, not with PJ in Berkeley, but anyway.
Right. Exactly.
So he went on to, in fact, when he was at the National Lampoon, he was involved in some publications they did with one of the founders, which were parodies of newspapers and so on. And
A high school yearbook.
Right, high school yearbook. And then he went on to be involved in this stage play called Lemmings. He was one of the writers for it. And that's the Lemmings project and the Lampoon's early publications really launched the careers of John Belushi and Chevy Chase and others. So he then went freelance. He was writing freelance for Playboy and Vanity Fair and Car and Driver and other publications. And he had an unusual style. Some people call it this gonzo journalism style. By the way, I should mention that.
And also foreign affairs correspondent for Rolling Stone.
That's right. He became the foreign affairs desk editor for Rolling Stone. And he would go to these war zones and really depraved places around the world and write these columns, which later ended up as books like Holidays in Hell and these other books he did. But he would bring the sort of gonzo journalism technique, which was to bring to life the reality of this and the causes of it. But the journalist is a part of the story himself. Right. So one of the things
that's part of that story, but it also allowed him to kind of go into details,
yes,
and make those details come to life.
Exactly,
through his participation,
mocking it in the process. So
he was good at mockery,
right? So I mentioned also when he was this sort of naive nitwit Maoist, as he thought, he was he didn't like people being mistreated. He didn't like people being bullied. He didn't like people who were arrogant and so on and so forth. And so he saw that in politics and developed a real animosity to political power and to the buffoonery that he saw. So he developed a classical liberal libertarian perspective on government power. And that led him to read The Road to Serfdom and some other things.
And to recommend, if he had to recommend one book to a president, he said Hayek's Road to Serfdom.
That's right.
And then he said, well, some of the phraseology is a bit Germanic. I'm not sure the president can handle that.
Hayek was a German speaker, right?
He was.
Yeah.
But so he then says, well, Milton and Rose Friedman's Free to Choose.
Yes. That was later, though. But still,
second choice.
That's exactly right. And so he combined that, and he became quite a champion, really, of this classical liberal tradition of Adam Smith and John Locke and Tocqueville. But he understood the economics of it. In fact, he wrote a couple of books on the economics of it, which are very funny.
He wrote a précis. He wrote a shortened rewrite of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations.
That's right.
That is good.
It's called On the Wealth of Nations.
It's good.
Yeah, it is good. We had an event we did with him on it. So in any event, he really went on to become one of the very best magazine writers ever. And people loved to read him because it was an adventure, it was a joy, it was insightful. So it wasn't just reporting, and he was actually cutting to the chase of what was really going on. His most popular book is a book called The Parliament of Horrors, which was a New York Times bestselling book. He wrote a number of New York Times bestselling books. And he was also involved in a documentary called War, I think War Means War, something like that, which was basically about a number of journalists in Iraq that were trying to get around the military's restrictions on getting information and reporting, and they were going undercover, so to speak, to these hellish spots and the reporting on it. And so this documentary really stars PJ. He's the main journalist in the story. So he developed a reputation of being fair, of not skipping over tough subjects, of putting himself in the center of the problem and then surviving. And he was sort of a rollicking guy. He did, unlike people like Hunter Thompson and others who were sort of, iconic gonzo journalist people, he didn't succumb to the kind of libertinism or nihilism that Thompson and others did. He really pulled back from that because he saw that these ideas or values and virtues were related to this Judeo-Christian tradition of the West, and what else does it mean, and how can I live that? But so he combined those values with fun, enormous talent, enormous creativity. He actually wrote over 20 books, and my blog on him was posted today for anybody's interested. In it, I listed, at least as of today, all the major articles that have been written, tributes from every possible media source, because even people who didn't agree with his classical liberal perspective, progressives and so on, had enormous respect for him and genuinely liked him because he was a genuinely nice, generous person who, getting back to the original point I made about his not liking bullying, he was a critic of abusing people, basically.
Right. So also, David, first of all, I want to compliment you on that excellent post that you did today. But you also included an array of zippy quotes from him, which I saw some in other eulogies, other obituaries for him. But I think you had the best collection of his one-liners.
There are thousands of them.
I know, but really? You picked some really good ones.
So in our case, we knew him from our inception. He was one of our founding board members of our board of advisors. He also emceed our most recent gala at our 30th anniversary. He charged us nothing. Right. He put himself up. Wow. He was just incredibly generous. And we also held 4 other events with him based around different books. And he would call me. We didn't have a new book coming out. And he said, I'm going on another Baton Death March, PR for this new book.
I can remember in the early days of the Cato Institute, when David and I were both there, that when we were doing Inquiry Magazine, and this became more to the fore when Glenn Garvin became the editor. But we were following P.J. O'Rourke, his witty comments about feminazis, his mockery of various shibboleths of the establishment, and an amazing guy from the earliest
He became
days.
A devoted husband and father to 3 children. His place in New Hampshire he called the Marsh Hare Farm because he loved Carroll, Lewis Carroll, and so on. And he also wrote for the Independent Review, and he's also contributed to one of our books. So he was just a very generous, and how he accomplished so much. One little story I'll tell really quick, which is funny, and you can read it. You just Google it. It was in Car and Driver. He wrote a lot for Car and Driver. Loved cars. He was a big car aficionado, and so on. And so he, when he was working for the Lampoon, the Lampoon was told, or somehow he heard, that this movie was going to be made in Los Angeles, and they needed to get this Ferrari driven to Los Angeles. And did they have any people that they could recommend? And so PJ said, I'll do it. And so he agreed to write. And this is a Ferrari 308 GTS. This is a pretty powerful car. So, and he had some trouble originally driving it. It kept on stalling. Anyway, his boss at the Lampoon was a guy named Julian Weber, who was a sort of a staid lawyer type, and always wore a tie and so on. And so he offered to drive with him. So PJ agreed to it, and they set off across the country. And it's an incredibly funny but insightful story about their travel across the United States.
What fun.
And this car, there's one episode when they come across this Porsche Turbo, and the Porsche guy thinks he's going to obviously outride this Ferrari. The Porsche guy had no idea what this Ferrari could do and what they did. And PJ was mocking the car as a Nazi something car. Anyway, it is funny. I recommend it.
I invite all of our friends who want to see this to go to independent.org. And you can find this article by David Theroux about P.J. O'Rourke, maverick, author, humorist, and cultural critic for liberty. May he rest in peace.
Also, Mary Theroux did an interview.
Yes,
she did
for us.
That's right.
Right. That was on his last book. And
that's quite recent.
That's quite recent. That's right. Exactly. And she
remarkable.
said that's one of the most fun things she's ever done.
Oh, I can imagine. That would really be fun.
Right.
Well, okay. May he rest in peace. As I said, we are going to, of course, reconvene in 2 weeks to talk with one another and our friends once again. With that said, I guess we should say goodbye, right? Goodbye, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Bill Evers.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. And all of our friends who've joined us here at Independent Outlook. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.